This story is entirely fictional. The characters, events, locations, and investigations described here were created for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual people, cases, or incidents is purely coincidental. This narrative explores warning signs, investigative methods, and the consequences of deception, not instructions for harm. On the morning of October 12th, a man called 911 to report his wife missing. His name was David Chen. He described waking at 7 o'clock, finding their bedroom empty, assuming Rachel had gone for an early run, but when she didn't return by 9, he grew concerned. She had never missed breakfast without sending a message. He checked their car still in the garage. He called her office, she hadn't arrived. By 9:47 a.m., he was on the phone with dispatch, his voice steady but strained, describing a woman he said he loved with an intensity that would later make detectives uneasy. For 2 days, David Chen was the devoted husband. He organized search teams. He walked through their neighborhood calling his wife's name. He spoke to reporters with red-rimmed eyes, begging the public for information. But inside the police station, in the evidence room where digital records were being extracted from their home security system, a different story was already emerging. The detective leading the case sat in front of computer monitors and realized something crucial. David Chen's timeline was impossible, and he had begun lying within minutes of the 911 call. What followed was not a race to find a missing woman. It was a careful, methodical exposure of how thoroughly someone could perform grief while committing murder. If you're settling in, get comfortable. This case unfolds through small contradictions that grew into something undeniable. Some episodes move quickly. This one rewards attention to detail. Subscribe for more original fictional crime documentaries, and let's begin. Rachel Chen was 34 years old and had been married to David for 9 years. She worked as a senior marketing manager at a mid-sized tech firm in the Portland suburbs, a position she had earned through reputation for reliability and clear thinking. Colleagues remembered her as organized without being rigid, confident without being dismissive, the kind of person who could manage 5 parallel projects without apparent stress. Her home reflected this. The house in Meadowbrook Heights, purchased 8 years prior, was maintained with the kind of deliberate care that suggested genuine investment rather than performance. The garden was modest, but intentional, raised beds for tomatoes and herbs, scheduled watering, seasonal plantings. Inside, there were no piles of unsorted mail, no cluttered counters. Rachel kept a monthly budget spreadsheet. She labeled photograph storage containers. She maintained a paper calendar in the kitchen where family commitments were recorded in black ink. Her relationships followed similar patterns. Every Thursday at 6 p.m., she called her father in Seattle. They spoke for exactly 30 minutes. She had done this without interruption for 14 years, through college, through her marriage, through promotions and relocations. It was not a burden she resented, it was a commitment she honored. Her sister, Michelle, lived in Bend, 2 hours south. They had dinner together the first Sunday of each month. That commitment, too, had never been broken. She was not without habits others might question. Rachel did not enjoy social drinking. She attended workplace functions but left early. She preferred solitude to large gatherings. She had declined invitations to her husband's company holiday party 3 years running, a choice that had created tension but which David had eventually accepted. But the most striking habit, the one that would eventually matter most, was this. Rachel was meticulous about communication when her routine changed. If she would be late coming home, she texted David. If she planned to go to the grocery store instead of going directly to the office, she sent a message. If she rescheduled the Thursday call with her father, she called him the night before to explain. She did not leave people waiting. She did not leave questions unanswered. This was who Rachel Chen was on October 11th, the day before she disappeared. This was the pattern detectives would use to begin understanding that something had gone very wrong. The Chen's marriage had not been troubled in any obvious way, at least. Not to the people who saw them together. They attended neighborhood events as a unit. They presented as functional, competent, engaged. But there were fractures beneath the surface that only a few people glimpsed. The first was financial. David managed the household accounts, a division of labor Rachel had agreed to years earlier. It seemed reasonable. He was an accountant, after all. But beginning around 2019, Rachel began asking questions about specific charges on their statements, restaurant expenses that David did not immediately explain, cash withdrawals that seemed inconsistent with their budgeted needs. David's explanations were smooth, client dinners, cash purchases for home repairs, but Rachel kept that calendar, and she cross-referenced dates, and she began to notice patterns David's explanations did not quite match. Approximately 2 years before her disappearance, Rachel discovered something more specific. She found a message on David's phone. He had left it unlocked while in the shower from someone named Kendra, a woman who worked in David's accounting firm. The message was brief but unmistakably intimate. "Looking forward to Thursday," it said. That was all. But the context, the casual tone, suggested a private arrangement. Rachel confronted David. He admitted to an emotional connection. He said nothing physical had happened. He said he had ended contact. He apologized extensively. Michelle, when Rachel told her, had recommended counseling. Rachel had considered it. But David resisted, saying the situation was resolved and that therapy would only create an unnecessary permanent record of a temporary lapse. Rachel, who scheduled her life down to 15-minute increments, did not push back as forcefully as she might have. This was one of her patterns. When faced with conflict in her marriage, she would yield rather than escalate. It was not weakness, exactly. It was a choice to preserve stability, even when stability was not the healthiest choice. But Rachel did not forget. She began, subtly, to monitor more closely. She checked bank statements with greater frequency. She asked David questions about his work schedule with increased specificity. She noted the days when he said he was working late, and she cross-referenced them against his phone location history, which she discovered she could access through their shared Apple account. She found that on several occasions, David's phone remained in downtown Portland, in the vicinity of the accounting firm, far longer than his explanation of a 7 p.m. departure time would have suggested. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Rachel had an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Margaret Sinclair, whom she had found on her own and did not tell David about. In that office, she described a marriage that was functionally intact but emotionally shallow. She described a husband she no longer fully trusted. She described an uncertainty about her future that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She told Dr. Sinclair that she had been researching divorce attorneys. Rachel did not tell David any of this. She kept her Thursday calls with her father consistent, did not want to worry him. She went to work. She maintained her calendar. She lived in a state of private crisis while presenting, outwardly, as the same composed woman she had always been. What Rachel did not know was that David had become aware of her surveillance. He had noticed her checking his location. He had seen the questions about his schedule. And he understood, in the way someone who has been caught cheating understands, that the situation had shifted. Rachel was no longer passively accepting his explanations. She was building a case. And if she followed through on the therapy notes, if she contacted an attorney, David's financial life would be scrutinized. And that scrutiny would reveal something Rachel had not yet discovered: his gambling. Regular visits to the Chinook Winds Casino, approximately 50 miles south, losses totaling nearly $30,000 over 2 years, money he had withdrawn in patterns designed to avoid triggering reporting requirements. On October 11th, David Chen was facing a crisis he could not control. His marriage was deteriorating. His infidelity had been discovered once, and was likely to be discovered again. His gambling debt was accelerating. And the woman he was married to, the woman who had documented everything, was preparing to leave him and expose him both financially and emotionally. That was the hidden fracture. That was the pressure that did not show. October 11th was a Thursday. Rachel woke at 6:15 a.m., as she did most mornings. She showered, dressed in the charcoal blazer and gray slacks that were standard professional attire for her, and ate a small breakfast of oatmeal and berries. David was still asleep. They had not shared a bed in 6 months, a practical matter, he said, because he moved too much at night. Rachel did not argue. She left for work at 7:45 a.m., arriving at the office by 8:20. Her colleagues noted nothing unusual. She attended a 9 a.m. team meeting regarding Q4 marketing strategy. She sent 2 emails. She took lunch at her desk, a salad she had prepared the night before, stored in a glass container that she washed immediately after eating. At 2:15 p.m., she called the car dealership to schedule maintenance for the Subaru. At 3:30 p.m., she texted David, "Running late. Traffic. Home by 6. The text was ordinary, consistent. It was the kind of message Rachel sent regularly. David's day was less documented. He told police later that he had worked from home, as he did every Thursday. No one could contradict this. His home office was a spare bedroom on the 2nd floor, door usually closed. No colleague had seen him. No client meeting had been scheduled that day. Rachel arrived home at 5:58 p.m., exactly as she had planned. Neighbors later reported seeing her car pull into the driveway. One neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Reeves from 3 houses down, had been watering her garden and had waved. Rachel had waved back. What happened in the house Between 5:58 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. WHEN, David later claimed he went to bed occurred entirely in private. There were no witnesses. There was no subsequent message. There was no indication from Rachel to anyone that anything was wrong. What is known is this: Rachel did not attend her office on October 12th. She did not call her father on Thursday evening. She did not send a message to her sister. She did not complete any of the dozens of small commitments that had structured her life with meticulous precision. Instead, she became absent, and that absence, precise and total, would be the loudest voice in the investigation to come. It was Michelle Chen who first raised the alarm. Rachel had missed their first Sunday of the month dinner. Michelle called the house at 7 p.m. on Sunday, October 15th. David answered. He said Rachel was not feeling well, that she had decided to stay home. He said he would have her call back. Rachel did not call back. Michelle called again on Monday morning. David said Rachel had a migraine, that she was resting. Michelle asked to speak to her sister. David said Rachel was asleep. Michelle, whose relationship with her sister was close and whose instinct was sharp, told David to have Rachel call her as soon as she woke. At 2 p.m. on Monday, Rachel still had not made contact. Michelle called their father. He had not received his Thursday call. This was unprecedented. Their father, Gerald Chen, called David immediately. David's response to Gerald was fluid, sympathetic, and carefully constructed. He said Rachel had been stressed about work. He said she had asked him for space. He said he was concerned too, and was giving her time to come around. He said if Rachel didn't contact them by Tuesday evening, they could check on her. But Gerald was 72 years old and had raised 2 daughters alone after his wife's death. He knew when he was being managed. He called Michelle back and told her they needed to do more than wait. Michelle drove to the house in Meadowbrook Heights on Monday at 5 p.m. She had a key Rachel had given her 1 year before. David opened the door before she could use it. He looked tired, she later said, but not panicked. He said Rachel was upstairs, that she was not in a state to receive visitors. Michelle did not accept this. She walked past him into the house. She found the master bedroom empty. The guest room was empty. The master bathroom showed signs of use towels in the hamper, a toothbrush in the holder, but no Rachel. Michelle walked through the entire house. She checked the basement. She checked the garage. Her sister, who had never failed to call her, who had never broken a commitment without explanation, was simply gone. Michelle called 911 at 5:47 p.m. The first officers arrived at 6:03 p.m. And here is where David Chen made the first of several mistakes he performed. When the officers asked him where his wife was, he did not remain calm and concerned. He elevated into something more theatrical. He placed his hand to his chest. He said, I don't know where she is. He repeated it. He allowed his voice to tremble. He looked at the officers with the expression of a man experiencing genuine shock. But the performance was too rehearsed. It lacked the texture of authentic distress. The officers would later describe it to detectives as controlled and consciously managed. One officer noted in his report that David had answered questions in complex, grammatically complete sentences while simultaneously claiming to be in a state of panic. Actual shock, the officer noted, usually resulted in shorter, more fragmented speech. When asked to describe what had happened, when Rachel had last been home, what she had been wearing, David's timeline was precise and detailed. He remembered the exact time he had heard her arrive. He remembered what she was wearing. He remembered her approximate location when he last saw her. This level of detail, under circumstances where a man genuinely believed his wife was missing, was unusual enough to be noted in the initial report. Detectives arrived at 7:15 p.m. Detective Sarah Martinez was the lead. She was an experienced investigator with an instinct for contradiction, and within the first few minutes of examining David Chen, she felt it. The sense that something about his presentation did not align with his claimed emotional state. The initial investigation pursued a disappearance framework. Rachel Chen, missing without communication, without taking her wallet or phone, raised the possibility of abduction, voluntary departure, or medical emergency. The first theory, offered by investigating officers and embraced by media coverage, was that Rachel had experienced a severe emotional crisis, possibly related to marital stress, and had left voluntarily. This theory had supporting evidence. Rachel's therapist, Dr. Sinclair, had been located by subpoena, and she confirmed that Rachel had been exploring divorce options. Rachel had been under stress. Rachel had expressed ambivalence about her future. The inference was that Rachel, overwhelmed, had simply left, but this theory collided almost immediately with Rachel's character and behavior patterns. Missing persons who leave voluntarily typically draw cash before leaving. Rachel had drawn no cash. They typically use their phone to maintain contact with someone, a friend, a family member, an attorney. Rachel's phone was never activated after she arrived home on October 11th. More problematically, Rachel's phone records showed that she had an appointment scheduled with an attorney, Margaret Hsu, for October 14, 3 days after she disappeared. Voluntary disappearance did not typically involve abandoning a meeting with a divorce attorney. It involved showing up. By October 16th, the investigation had shifted toward the possibility of abduction, and David Chen had become the man organizing the search. He created flyers. He spoke to reporters. He walked through neighborhoods calling his wife's name. He wept at a public vigil organized by community members. And Detective Sarah Martinez watched all of it. She noted every gesture, every word choice, every moment where David's attention seemed to focus more on the cameras than on the search itself. She had been a detective for 16 years. She had learned that genuine grief and performed grief had different rhythms, different breathing patterns, different focal points. And David Chen's performance, however skilled, had the quality of someone acting the role of a devastated husband rather than being one. By October 18th, Martinez had applied for a warrant to examine the Chen residence and the vehicles. She wanted to know what the physical space could reveal. She wanted to know what evidence the home had preserved. The first meaningful discovery came from the smart home system. The Chens had installed a system 4 years prior that tracked door locks, lighting, and thermostat adjustments via phone app. It had been set up primarily for convenience. Rachel could pre-warm the house on her drive home from work. When technicians extracted the data, they found a detailed record of October 11th. At 5:52 p.m., the front door had been unlocked. At 5:58 p.m., the garage door had been opened. Rachel's car had arrived at 5:59 p.m. The arrival timed within seconds of her text message. At 6:03 p.m., the garage door had closed. At 6:47 p.m., the front door had been locked from the inside. This was consistent with David's statement that Rachel had come home, but the data also showed something else. At 11:34 p.m., the front door had been unlocked. At 11:45 p.m., the garage door had been opened. At 12:15 a.m., the garage door had been closed. At 12:16 a.m., the front door had been locked again. When confronted with this, David claimed he had simply taken out the trash. He remembered nothing specific about the time. He had just carried bags to the street. But the warrant had also authorized examination of the vehicle security camera, a dashcam Rachel had installed in her car for insurance purposes. The dashcam footage for October 11th showed David leaving the property at 11:35 p.m. in Rachel's Subaru. The camera had recorded 23 minutes of driving routes through residential neighborhoods, along the outskirts of the city, toward industrial areas. At 12:04 a.m., the footage showed David pulling into a self-storage facility in an area called Harborview. He had remained inside for 8 minutes. When he returned to the car, he was no longer holding anything visible. He drove home. The return journey took 14 minutes. When asked about this, David again claimed ignorance. He said he had not taken Rachel's car that night. He said Martinez was misreading the data. But the storage facility confirmed that David had a unit there, rented under his name, and that his key card had accessed it at 12:05 a.m. on October 12th. The unit itself, when opened under warrant, contained items from the marital home, a painting Rachel had valued, some of her jewelry, a framed photograph of Rachel and her father, and, in a locked plastic container in the far corner of the unit, investigators found a pair of work gloves, a bottle of industrial-strength cleaning solution, and clothing with microscopic blood particles that would later be confirmed as Rachel's DNA. The blood evidence shifted the investigation entirely. This was no longer about a missing person who might be found. This was now a homicide investigation. The question was no longer where is Rachel, but what did David do? For approximately 48 hours, investigators pursued an alternative theory. The evidence in the storage unit, they considered, could have been placed there by someone other than David. The key card access was registered to David, yes, but he could have shared the code. The items in the unit could have been planted. The alternative suspect became Marcus Reed, a former colleague of David's, who had been terminated from his accounting firm 2 years prior. Reed had been vocal about his belief that David had sabotaged his work and that David had been complicit in his firing. Reed had shown up at David's office 3 times after his termination, making threats. There was a documented complaint with building security. The theory was that Reed, seeking revenge, had killed Rachel to frame David. But this theory fractured almost immediately under investigative pressure. Reed's phone location data placed him in Seattle on October 11th and 12th, confirmed by his attendance at a family wedding and corroborated by over 40 witnesses. His credit card had been used in Seattle. His vehicle had been identified on highway cameras entering Washington. There was no possible way for Reed to have been in the Portland area on the night in question. More definitively, forensic analysis of the storage unit revealed that the items had been placed in the container over time, some showing months of dust accumulation. The cleaning solution was a product David had purchased on September 19th, nearly 4 weeks before Rachel disappeared, confirmed through a credit card receipt and the store's video surveillance. This suggested premeditation, planning, preparation, not reactive desperation. Reed was cleared, and with his clearance, the focus returned entirely to David Chen. By October 22nd, investigators had sufficient evidence to develop a detailed theory of what had occurred. A reconstruction was presented to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor found it credible. Investigators believed that David Chen had spent weeks, possibly months, planning Rachel's death. He had rented a storage unit and had begun placing items there, objects he anticipated needing or objects he wanted hidden. He had purchased cleaning supplies. He had thought through logistics. On October 11th, when Rachel arrived home at 5:58 p.m., David confronted her. The context was likely a final conflict about his infidelity, his gambling, the impending divorce. Exactly what triggered the violence remained unknown. David would later claim he could not remember, but the evidence suggested a struggle. Rachel had defensive wounds on her hands. There were signs of violence in the master bedroom, droplets and staining that had been cleaned but not eliminated. Rachel had been killed, likely by blunt force trauma, though the body was never recovered and cause of death could not be officially established. David had then spent the hours from approximately 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. cleaning the scene. He had used the industrial solution to remove blood and evidence. He had worked methodically. He had placed the compromised items, gloves, solution, stained clothing into containers that he would later transport to the storage unit. At 11:35 p.m., he had loaded something into Rachel's car. What exactly remained a question. Her body, possibly, or something else. He had driven to the Harborview storage facility and had accessed his unit. Whatever he had been carrying had been disposed of or stored in a location detectives never discovered. By 12:30 a.m., David had returned home and had locked the front door. He had then gone to bed. He had slept. The next morning, he had called 911 with his carefully constructed story. He had performed shock and grief. He had become the devoted husband searching for his missing wife, and he had maintained that performance for 2 weeks until the evidence had become impossible to deny. David was brought into the station on October 22nd at 2 p.m., not under arrest, but as a person of interest. Detective Martinez conducted the interrogation in a room with a recording device running. The session lasted 4 hours. For the first 2 hours, David maintained his denial. He had not killed his wife. He had not transported her. He did not know what was in the storage unit. Someone else must have accessed his unit and planted the evidence. His key card could have been copied. His access code could have been shared. He was being framed. But at 5:47 p.m., after Martinez presented the evidence methodically, the storage unit access, the dashcam footage, the credit card receipt for the cleaning solution, the timeline that made his story physically impossible, David asked for an attorney. The interrogation ended. David was booked into custody. For 6 days, David maintained silence. His attorney advised him not to speak. The prosecutor was building a case that seemed, to everyone inside the courthouse, airtight. There were no witnesses to the crime itself, but the circumstantial evidence was extensive. The physical evidence was damning. On October 28th, David's attorney requested a meeting with the prosecutor. What followed was a negotiation that lasted 11 hours. By midnight, an agreement had been reached. David would plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, the prosecutor would not pursue first-degree charges, which would have carried a sentence of life without parole. When David took his plea on October 30th, he spoke for the first time about what had happened. His statement was limited, coached by his attorney, and emotionally blank. He said that he and Rachel had argued about his personal issues. He said the situation had escalated. He said he had lost control. He did not describe the violence, He did not describe what he had done with the body. He did not apologize. He said only that he had caused her death. The judge imposed a sentence of 19 years, which David would be eligible to appeal in 14. Rachel's body was never found. Despite extensive searches directed by information from David's storage unit and the areas he had frequented, no remains were recovered. She existed in the investigation only as evidence: blood samples, phone records, the testimony of colleagues and family members, the physical items he had tried to hide. Michelle and Gerald began the process of having Rachel declared dead. It took 14 months. The memorial service was attended by approximately 300 people: colleagues, friends, community members, even some detectives who had worked the case. Rachel's father gave a statement about his daughter's integrity, her reliability, her commitment to family. He spoke of missing the Thursday calls. He said there would be an empty chair in his house for the rest of his life. Rachel's colleagues at the marketing firm established a small scholarship in her name for students pursuing business ethics. The case sparked regional conversation about domestic abuse and the ways that controlled and controlling partners often present themselves publicly as devoted and grief-stricken when violence occurs. The tactics David had used, maintaining an appearance of normalcy, appearing shocked and devastated to authorities, creating the public narrative of a searching and concerned husband, were recognized as consistent with patterns seen in other domestic homicides. What became clear, in retrospect, was that David's greatest skill had not been in committing the crime. It had been in performing the emotions that should have followed from innocence. He had understood, instinctively, that the best way to hide guilt was to present exactly the role that an innocent person should embody. But genuine grief has a texture that performance cannot perfectly replicate. It breaks. It loses consistency. It contains contradictions and irrationalities. And Detective Sarah Martinez, trained in those subtle recognitions, had seen through the performance from the beginning. What remains most striking about the Chen case is not the violence, which was neither unusual nor particularly premeditated in its method. What remains striking is the gap between performance and truth. David Chen stood in front of cameras and called his wife's name, and he did it knowing she was dead. He organized search teams and walked through neighborhoods, and he did it knowing they would not find her because he had already decided where she would not be found. Rachel Chen, who had scheduled every moment of her life, who had never missed a commitment, who had kept her Thursday calls with her father, without exception, for 14 years, Rachel had simply vanished from the world. Not because she chose to leave, but because someone she had trusted enough to marry had decided that losing her was preferable to being exposed by her. The message Rachel never sent on October 11th at 6 p.m., the Thursday call that never happened at exactly 6 p.m., the Sunday dinner that never occurred, these absences spoke louder than any words she might have said. And in the space where Rachel's presence should have been, there was only the evidence of what someone had done to silence her. A marriage that looked stable, but was built on deception. A performance of grief that fooled everyone except the one person who had learned to see through it. The saddest part is this: Rachel had almost escaped. She had scheduled the attorney appointment. She was building her case. She was preparing to leave. She was so close to freedom that it was visible on the calendar, penciled in for 3 days after she died. She just didn't know that time had already run out. 19 years was not an end. For Rachel Chen's family, for the investigators who had built the case, and for the legal system that had convicted David Chen of her death, the verdict marked the conclusion of one phase and the beginning of another, a different kind of search. One driven not by the hope of finding Rachel alive, but by the need to understand what had truly happened in the hours after she came home on October 11th. The most pressing unanswered question remained the same question that had haunted the investigation since October 22nd. Where was Rachel's body? The storage unit had confirmed David's planning and his attempt to conceal evidence. The dashcam footage had placed him at specific locations on the night of her death. The bloodstains and the timeline had established opportunity and motive. But Rachel herself, her remains, her final resting place, the physical proof of what had become of her, remained absent from the investigation. During the trial, this absence had actually worked in David's favor, in a limited way. His attorney had argued, repeatedly, that without a body, without cause of death definitively established. The prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on circumstantial evidence. The jury had disagreed, finding the circumstantial evidence sufficient, but the body remained missing. And missing bodies created unfinished cases, regardless of conviction. 6 months after David's sentencing, Detective Sarah Martinez was promoted to supervisor of the Major Crimes Unit. It was recognition of her work on the Chen case, a case that had been built methodically, presented clearly, and prosecuted successfully, without the element that most prosecutors considered essential, physical remains. Before she accepted the promotion, Martinez made a single request, that the Chen case remain open, that it not be filed away as solved, and that resources continue to be directed toward locating Rachel's remains. The department agreed. In the first year after David's imprisonment, investigators attempted multiple lines of inquiry. They searched areas where David's vehicle had been documented on the dashcam footage. They examined properties he had accessed or visited. They interviewed people in his life, colleagues, family members, his former lover Kendra, to see if anyone had information about his movements or his intentions. They explored the possibility that he had disposed of Rachel's body at the Harborview storage facility in ways that evaded their initial search. But nothing yielded results. No remains were found. No credible witness came forward. No new evidence emerged that pointed to a specific location. By year 2, the investigation had entered a holding pattern. The case was not cold. Exactly, cold cases implied that all reasonable investigative avenues had been exhausted, but it had become dormant, waiting for David to provide information he had not yet been willing to share. David Chen adjusted to prison life with an unsettling normalcy. He was incarcerated at Stafford Correctional Institution, a medium-security facility in the rural eastern part of the state. His cellmate was a man named Luther Grant, serving a 23-year sentence for armed robbery. Grant later described David to investigators as quiet, organized, and completely detached from what he did. David's prison file showed no behavioral incidents. He attended educational programs. He worked in the prison library. He kept his cell meticulously clean. He did not engage in the social hierarchies that typically dominated prison culture. Other inmates largely left him alone, sensing something in his demeanor that discouraged connection. In his 8th year of imprisonment, David requested a meeting with Detective Martinez. The request surprised her. David's attorney had not initiated it. There had been no change in his legal situation. Nothing, as far as she knew, had prompted the request. When they met in a visitation room at Stafford, David was 43 years old. He had developed gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, but his posture remained straight, his manner controlled. He looked, Martinez thought, almost exactly as he had in the interrogation room 12 years prior. The years had not broken him or softened him. They had simply aged him. "I wanted to talk to you," David said, "about what I did. Not for legal reasons. I'm not looking for a deal. I just wanted you to know that I remember. That I know what I took from people." Martinez waited. She had learned, over 24 years as a detective, that when someone wanted to talk, the best strategy was to listen. Rachel was not a difficult person, David continued. She was straightforward. She was honest. She expected honesty from other people, and when she didn't get it, she didn't know how to adjust. I took advantage of that, and then I killed her, because I couldn't face the consequences of being exposed. "Where is she?" Martinez asked. David did not answer immediately. When he did speak, his response was oblique. "There's a property about 40 miles northwest of the city. Route 47, past the turnoff tomorrow. There's an old logging road. My family owned a cabin out there years ago. We sold it when I was in college, but I still knew where it was. I still remembered the access codes from the gate." "Is Rachel there?" "I don't know," David said. "Not anymore. I placed her there on October 12th, but I don't know if she's still there. 13 years is a long time. Animals, weather, the forest itself, things change." He provided a series of coordinates and a description of landmarks. He did not provide certainty or direct instruction. He provided only a direction in which to look. The property had been developed into a resort, a modest destination for people seeking retreat in the Cascade foothills. The owners were cooperative when investigators arrived with warrants. They allowed extensive searches of the grounds, particularly areas that corresponded to David's description of the original cabin location. The cabin itself no longer existed. It had been removed during the property's development 15 years prior. But the location David had described, an area roughly 300 meters from the main lodge, was an accessible but undeveloped section of forest dense with Douglas fir and overgrown with understory vegetation. Search teams spent 3 weeks examining the area. They used ground-penetrating radar. They conducted systematic excavations. They collected soil samples. They found nothing that conclusively indicated the presence of human remains, but they did find something. Approximately 15 meters from the coordinates David had provided, buried roughly 2 feet below the surface, they found fragments of fabric that matched the clothing Rachel had been wearing on October 11th. The fabric was severely degraded, but it was identifiable through fiber analysis and the presence of material consistent with the boutique where Rachel had purchased the garment. What they did not find were bones or teeth or any significant skeletal material. What they found was evidence of fabric, evidence that something had been buried there, but not proof of what had become of Rachel herself. The discovery, while significant, created as many questions as it answered. If Rachel's body had been buried at the location David had indicated, where was it now? Had it been moved? Had it decomposed beyond recovery? Had animals scattered the remains across a wide area? Forensic anthropologists examined the soil. They found no evidence of animal disturbance consistent with deliberate movement. They found no significant bone fragments. They found no indicators of a gravesite in the archaeological sense. It was possible that David's description had been approximate rather than precise, and that Rachel's actual burial location was nearby but different. It was possible that 13 years of forest decomposition had rendered the remains essentially unrecoverable, or it was possible that David had not, in fact, buried Rachel at all, that he had disposed of her in another way in water, in a remote ravine scattered across a wide area, and had provided the coordinates as a way of creating the appearance of cooperation without actually revealing the truth. When Martinez met with David again, this time to confront him with the fabric evidence and the absence of remains, David maintained his posture of detached cooperation. He did not insist that the fabric proved his story. He did not demand credit for the information he had provided. He simply said, "I told you what I remembered. I don't know what's happened to her since then." The investigation stalled. The property was searched again the following spring, with metal detectors and additional forensic protocols. Nothing conclusive emerged. Rachel remained, in the most literal sense, missing, a woman whose death had been established beyond legal doubt, but whose body had not been found. What the legal system had resolved, media outlets and true crime podcasters began to reconsider. The case, which had seemed closed after David's conviction, reopened in the court of public opinion. Podcasters interviewed investigators, family members, and forensic experts. YouTube documentaries examined the evidence. Reddit communities debated whether David had actually killed Rachel at all, or whether he was protecting someone else, or whether the entire investigation had been fundamentally flawed. A particular subset of internet investigation focused on the possibility that David was lying about the disposal location as a form of psychological control. Some argued that he had kept Rachel's body location secret as a way of maintaining power over the investigation, the media, and the public consciousness long after his conviction. He could not be in control of freedom, but he could be in control of a mystery. As long as Rachel remained physically unfound, the case remained culturally alive, and an alive case meant an alive connection to the man who had caused it. Other theorists suggested that the fabric evidence itself was compromised, or that investigators had been mistaken in their identification. A few voices argued, with impressive rhetorical skill if limited evidentiary support, that Rachel had never been in that location at all, and that David had been provided false information, perhaps by another party, or perhaps had simply guessed at coordinates in an area he vaguely remembered from family visits decades prior. Michelle Chen, Rachel's sister, gave an interview to a podcast called Remains, in which she addressed the growing cottage industry of speculation. "My sister is dead," Michelle said, her voice controlled but clearly strained. "The man who killed her is in prison. Those are facts. What happened to her body is a separate question, and I understand why people are fascinated by it. But I'm tired of hearing from people who treat the absence of Rachel's remains as if it's a puzzle game. She's not a puzzle. She's a person who was murdered, and her murder was solved. The fact that we don't have her body doesn't make the conviction less real or less justified." The interview was powerful, and it shifted some of the discourse. But it did not stop the investigation into the body, nor did it diminish the cultural fascination with the unanswered question. In year 13 of his sentence, David Chen filed for appeal. His grounds were limited but specific. He argued that his conviction had been obtained through insufficient evidence, that the prosecution had not met the burden of proof required for murder, and that the lack of a body, combined with the lack of a witness, made the case fundamentally circumstantial and therefore legally insufficient. The appeal was assigned to a 3-judge panel. Oral arguments were conducted. The prosecution presented its case again: the storage unit, the dashcam footage, the evidence of premeditation, the statements from colleagues about the marital stress, the timeline that made David's explanations impossible. David's attorney argued that circumstantial evidence, no matter how extensive, was not the same as proof. There was no murder weapon, there was no cause of death, there was no body, there was no confession. What there was a theory. And theories, however plausible, were not sufficient to deprive someone of freedom. The appeals court deliberated for 6 weeks. In the end, they upheld the conviction. The judges found that while the evidence was circumstantial, it was sufficiently substantial to support the jury's verdict. The absence of a body, they wrote, did not make the case insubstantial. It made it unusual, but not insufficient. David's appeal was denied. He remained imprisoned. 15 years after Rachel's disappearance, Detective Martinez sat in her office at police headquarters and reviewed the case one final time. She was planning to retire at the end of the year. She wanted to understand, before she left, what she did not know. The evidence that David had killed Rachel was, she believed, sound. The behavioral indicators, the physical evidence, the timeline, all of it pointed toward homicide. She was confident in the conviction. What she was not confident in was the narrative of how. David had claimed, in his prison meeting, that he had buried Rachel at the location near the resort property, but the search had not found remains. And while decomposition could account for the absence of bones, it seemed unlikely to account for the complete absence of any skeletal material whatsoever. Human bodies, buried in forest soil, typically left traces: teeth, skull fragments, bone material resistant to degradation. She reviewed the dashcam footage again, watching David's drive from the house on October 11th. The timestamps showed him leaving at 11:35 p.m., reaching the storage facility at 12:04 a.m., and returning to the house at 12:30 a.m., 55 minutes. That was the window. That was the amount of time he claimed he had spent accessing his storage unit, placing items in a container, and driving back home. But what if he had not gone to the storage facility to deposit evidence? What if he had gone to deposit something else? Martinez pulled the resort property coordinates again. The storage facility was in Harborview, approximately 7 miles from the city center, in an industrial corridor. The resort property was 40 miles northwest, past the turnoff to Morrow, accessed by Route 47. It was possible, Martinez calculated, to drive from the house to Harborview, from Harborview to the resort property, and from the resort property back to Harborview and home. But only if the actual storage facility visit was brief or non-existent. The dashcam showed him at the facility, but dashcam footage could be explained if he had taken a slightly different route, if the timestamps were slightly different, if the deposit at the storage facility had taken only 5 minutes instead of 8. She did not pursue this line of investigation further. The case was solved. David was convicted. He was imprisoned. The question of whether he had disposed of Rachel's body at the location he claimed, or at some other location entirely, would remain unanswered. And perhaps, Martinez thought, that was appropriate. Perhaps the case that had been solved circumstantially should remain unsolved in its most concrete detail. Perhaps that was the cost of a murder, without a body, not just for the family, but for the investigators who had worked it. The case would never feel entirely closed. What changed came from an unexpected direction. In year 18 of his sentence, David Chen requested a meeting with a Christian chaplain at Stafford Correctional. The chaplain, Father Thomas Reeves, had been visiting David for 3 years. Over the course of their conversations, Father Reeves believed that David had begun a genuine process of spiritual reckoning. In what Father Reeves understood as a confession and therefore protected by religious privilege, David described in detail what he had done with Rachel's body. He had not buried her. He had not left her in the forest to decompose. He had taken her, that night on October 12th, to a location he had not disclosed to investigators. He had weighted her body with objects he had collected over months. He had driven, not to the resort property, but to a remote section of the Cascade River, approximately 50 miles north of the city. He had driven at night on logging roads to a location where the river ran deep and fast and where the banks were steep and difficult to access. And in the early morning hours of October 12th, he had released Rachel into the water. He had not, he explained to Father Reeves, anticipated that she would ever be found. He had assumed that the river would carry her body downstream, that time and water would do the work of making her disappear. He had not anticipated that she would become, in a legal sense, a person who had simply vanished. He had not anticipated that her absence would haunt his family for decades. But he had done it, he said, because he could not bear the thought of her body being discovered. Not because he hoped for forgiveness, but because he wanted her to be truly gone. He wanted the erasure to be complete. He wanted there to be a place, finally, where she was not a crime scene and not an investigation and not a mystery. She was simply lost. She was simply part of the river and the forest and the landscape. Father Reeves, bound by religious privilege, carried this information with him. He did not immediately share it, but he encouraged David to consider informing authorities or allowing him to inform authorities on David's behalf. David refused. He said that the information was shared in confession, that it was privileged, and that he would not authorize its release. For 3 years, Father Reeves maintained silence. But in year 21 of David's imprisonment, Father Reeves experienced a crisis of conscience. He contacted the diocese. He consulted with lawyers. He ultimately determined that while the sacramental seal of confession was binding in church law, he had an ethical and potentially legal obligation to share information about a crime, a completed crime, a crime that had already resulted in conviction, but a crime nonetheless. With careful legal guidance, and with David's knowledge though not his permission, Father Reeves provided law enforcement with David's account of disposing of Rachel's body in the Cascade River. Investigators immediately understood the implications. If Rachel's body had been placed in the river 18 years prior, the possibility of recovery was minimal. The river ran swift and cold. 18 years of water movement, decomposition, and the mechanics of flowing water meant that any remains would be scattered across miles of riverbed. But the river was also public land, documented, traversable. Search teams could organize recovery efforts. They could dredge certain sections. They could collect information from people who had used the river since 1998. They could try, at least, to find something. The search of the Cascade River began in early spring when water levels were manageable. Investigators used sonar mapping, underwater cameras, and trained search divers. They searched a 10-mile section of river from the location David had described, expanding gradually in both directions. It took 3 weeks. But on a cold morning in late March, in a section of river where the current created natural pooling and sediment accumulation, search divers recovered human remains. Skeletal fragments, deteriorated beyond complete recovery, but identifiable through dental records as consistent with Rachel Chen. The remains were brought to the surface. They were examined by forensic anthropologists, who confirmed age, sex, and identity through dental comparison to Rachel's dental records. After 18 years in the river, Rachel had been found. Her family was notified first. Michelle, who received the call from Detective Martinez, later said that the news, while bringing some measure of closure, did not diminish the fundamental trauma of Rachel's absence. "We always knew she was dead," Michelle told a reporter, "but now we know she's in the river. We know she was put there by someone she trusted. And we know that she didn't have to be. She could have had a burial. She could have been treated with dignity. Instead, her husband threw her into the water like she was garbage." Rachel was given a funeral service. Her remains were cremated. On a day when the weather was clear and the light was soft, her family scattered her ashes at a place on the riverbank where her father had taken her years before to teach her to skip stones. David Chen made a statement through his attorney, acknowledging the information he had provided to Father Reeves. He did not apologize precisely, but he confirmed the facts as Father Reeves had reported them. He said, "She's in the river now. She is part of that place. I think in some way she would have preferred that to a grave." It was not remorse. It was not acceptance of responsibility. It was the same controlled, detached articulation that had characterized his entire engagement with the investigation. He had confirmed the truth not because he felt contrition, but because secrecy was no longer possible, and because, perhaps, he wanted to be known as someone capable of telling the truth, even terrible truth, even 18 years after the fact. The case was formally closed. Rachel was no longer missing. She was deceased, recovered, and laid to rest. The investigation that had defined Detective Martinez's career for 2 decades was finally, truly complete. But there were questions that remained. Why had David not simply disclosed the river location when he was first arrested? Why had he maintained the fiction of the forced burial for 18 years? Was it possible that he had genuinely believed that confessing to a location without a body was somehow less culpable than confessing to the disposition in the river? Or was it simply that the secrecy had become its own form of control, a secret that David could maintain, and that could keep him, psychologically, connected to the crime in a way that complete confession might have severed. Detective Martinez never asked him. She retired a month after Rachel's remains were recovered. She had spent 25 years solving crimes. She had solved this one, and the solving of it, the completion of it, the movement from mystery to known it was enough. She did not need to understand David's psychology, his motivations, his reasons. She needed only to know that he had killed Rachel Chen, and that he was imprisoned for it, and that Rachel's family had been able to bury her remains and say goodbye. That, finally, was closure enough. 5 years after Rachel's remains were recovered, a documentary filmmaker named Lisa Chen No relation to Rachel made a feature-length film about the case. It was titled The River's Memory, and it attempted to explore not just the crime and investigation, but the nature of absence and closure in the modern era. The film interviewed Michelle Chen, now in her 60s. It interviewed Detective Sarah Martinez, in her first year of retirement. It interviewed Father Reeves, who explained his reasoning for breaking the seal of confession and his ongoing spiritual wrestling with that decision. It did not interview David Chen. He refused to participate. In the film's final scene, Michelle stands on the riverbank at the place where Rachel's ashes were scattered. She holds a single stone in her hand, the kind of stone that people skip across water, the kind of stone her sister had learned to skip at this very location years before her death. "People want to know," Michelle says to the camera, "if knowing what happened to her body made things better. Did finding her in the river give us closure? And the answer is complicated. It's better to know than not to know, but it's not better to have lost her. There's no version of this story where things are actually good. There's only different kinds of bad. And we live with the kind of bad that includes knowing, now, that she was in the water all these years, that she was cold and alone and decomposing while we were going about our lives, that there was nothing to bury except ashes, that we never got to see her one last time." She skips the stone across the river. It touches the water once, twice, 3 times, and then sinks. "The investigators did good work," Michelle continues. "They found the person who did this. They convicted him, and, eventually, they found her. But Rachel should never have been a river. She should have been a person, living her life, calling her father on Thursday nights, going to Sunday dinners with me. That's the thing nobody solves. That's the thing that stays." The camera pulls back. The river continues flowing, the forest remains unchanged, and the absence that began on October 11, 1998, persists, even now, not as a mystery but as a permanent presence in the lives of everyone who loved Rachel Chen. The recovery of Rachel Chen's remains, and David's subsequent confirmation of his account in the river, sparked an unexpected legal and philosophical debate within the criminal justice system. Law professors at 3 regional universities wrote articles examining the implications of a conviction obtained without physical evidence, later confirmed by information provided through religious privilege rather than through standard investigative channels. The central question was deceptively simple. What did it mean for the law when a case was solved through circumstantial evidence, affirmed by appeals courts, and then retroactively confirmed by the defendant's own statement decades later? Had justice been served? Had the system worked as intended? Or had there been a fundamental flaw in the process that had simply been concealed by time and the eventual emergence of truth? One law professor, Dr. Helena Vasquez from the University of Washington, published a paper titled "Absence as Evidence: The Chen Case and the Future of Corpse-Less Prosecutions." In it, she argued that David's eventual confession actually vindicated the prosecution's initial theory, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about false convictions in similar cases. How many people, she asked, had been imprisoned based on circumstantial evidence that turned out to be wrong? How many cases had been solved incorrectly, with the wrong person imprisoned, simply because the alternative admitting uncertainty was professionally and institutionally unacceptable? The David Chen case became a footnote in legal education, cited in courses on evidence, criminal procedure, and the psychology of criminal investigation. His conviction, already legally sound, was reinforced by his eventual confession. But the case also became a cautionary tale about the limits of certainty and the dangers of relying on theories, however plausible, when direct evidence was unavailable. More immediately, the case prompted Oregon to revise its guidelines on prosecuting cases without recovered remains. The new guidelines, adopted in 2021, required additional investigative steps and a higher threshold of circumstantial evidence before prosecutors could move forward with murder charges in cases where a body had not been found. The guidelines were named after Rachel Chen, In a quiet way, they represented a recognition that her case, though solved correctly, had revealed a gap in how the system protected against the potential for error. Father Thomas Reeves' decision to break the seal of confession by providing David Chen's account to law enforcement triggered a broader crisis within the Catholic Church and among religious leaders across denominations. The Diocese of Portland, where Reeves served, conducted an internal investigation into his conduct. Theologians and legal scholars debated whether he had acted appropriately. The sacramental seal of confession is among the most sacred protections in Catholic theology. Priests are bound, under church law, and often under civil law as well, to maintain absolute confidentiality regarding anything shared in confession. The seal is considered inviolable. No crime, no matter how serious, is supposed to outweigh the seal's protection. Father Reeves argued that he had not violated the seal itself. He had consulted with church legal advisors, he had obtained permission from the diocese before sharing the information, and crucially, the crime in question, Rachel's murder, had already been solved. No investigation depended on his testimony. No prosecution required his disclosure. David was already imprisoned. The only question was where Rachel's body was, a question that had haunted her family for 18 years. His position was that the pastoral obligation to the Chen family to help them find peace and closure outweighed the absolute application of the confessional seal in a case where the crime had already been adjudicated and the perpetrator already imprisoned. The diocese ultimately supported him, issuing a statement that Father Reeves had acted with pastoral compassion and institutional sensitivity to the responsibilities of the Church in a modern, secular legal system. But the issue remained divisive. Conservative Catholic scholars argued that any breach of the seal, for any reason, weakened the integrity of the sacrament and discouraged genuine repentance. If a person entering confession could not be absolutely certain that their words would remain confidential, they argued, the sacrament lost its power. Progressive theologians countered that absolute rules sometimes caused absolute harm, and that Christianity was fundamentally about compassion, which sometimes meant making difficult choices about which competing values to prioritize. The debate never reached a clear resolution, but it resulted in the Catholic Church adopting more detailed guidelines about when clergy might consult with legal advisors about information obtained in confession and under what circumstances they might cooperate with criminal investigations. The Chen case became a teaching point in seminaries across the country, a case study in the intersection of religious authority and civil law. Father Reeves remained at Stafford Correctional for another 8 years, continuing his pastoral work with inmates. He never spoke publicly about his decision regarding David Chen, but his bishop, in a private conversation years later, told him, "You did the right thing, and that's all that matters." Meadowbrook Heights, the suburb where Rachel had lived and where she had been killed, underwent a subtle but significant transformation in the years following her death and recovery. The neighborhood, initially horrified by the revelation that a murder had occurred within its quiet streets, gradually shifted from denial to awareness to advocacy. The Neighborhood Association began hosting annual community dinners in October, around the anniversary of Rachel's disappearance. These were not advertised as memorials exactly, but as opportunities for neighbors to gather and discuss community safety, domestic violence awareness, and the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships. One neighbor, Patricia Reeves, the woman who had waved to Rachel on the afternoon of October 11th, became a trained domestic violence counselor. She volunteered for the regional domestic violence hotline and spoke at community centers about the patterns she had observed in the Chen household and the ways that neighbors might recognize similar dynamics in their own communities. "We saw David with his arm around Rachel at the neighborhood barbecue," Mrs. Reeves explained in one community presentation. "We saw them together at school events. They looked like a normal couple, but, looking back, I remember thinking that Rachel always seemed tense when David was around." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She was careful about what she said. She didn't contradict him. If he told a story, she let it stand, even if I could see her jaw tighten. These are small things. These are things that seem, in the moment, like ordinary marriage dynamics. But they're also patterns that abusers use: control through contradiction, through financial management, through isolation from support networks. And then, sometimes, when the victim is about to escape, control through violence. Mrs. Reeves' presentations were attended by dozens of people, many of them women who recognized patterns in their own relationships. Several attendees later sought counseling or legal assistance, Whether any of these interventions prevented future violence was unknowable, but the effect was palpable. A community that had been passive had become active. A neighborhood that had been comfortable had become vigilant. The Meadowbrook Heights Neighborhood Association also established a Rachel Chen Scholarship for girls and young women in the school district, awarded annually to students who demonstrated academic achievement and community engagement. The scholarship was modest $2,000 per recipient, but it ensured that Rachel's name remained part of the community's public consciousness. As David Chen moved through his late 50s and early 60s in Stafford Correctional, the man he became was, in many ways, unrecognizable from the man he had been. Prison had not reformed him. Reform implies a person willing to be reformed, willing to accept responsibility and change. But prison had, perhaps, clarified him. It had stripped away the performance that had defined his life. He was diagnosed with stage 3 prostate cancer in 2024, at the age of 63. The diagnosis meant that he would likely die in prison, which was, statistically, where most long-term inmates died. Prison medical care extended life, but it could not indefinitely postpone death. David accepted the diagnosis with the same controlled demeanor that had characterized his entire incarceration. He refused aggressive treatment. He chose palliative care instead, pain management, and acceptance of the end. Prison chaplains noted that he did not seek reconciliation or spiritual consolation. He did not request meetings with Father Reeves, though Reeves offered. He simply accepted the reality of his mortality with the same flatness he had applied to everything else. In his final years, David was moved to the infirmary at Stafford, a section of the prison reserved for inmates with serious medical conditions. His cellmate, Luther Grant, who had been his companion for 26 years, visited him regularly, despite having no obligation to do so. Later, Grant told a researcher studying long-term prisoners, David never stopped being the same person. He never got angry. He never cried. He never seemed to actually feel anything about what he did. But at the end, when he was dying, I think maybe he understood something about the people he hurt. Not because he felt bad about it, but because he was experiencing, finally, what they experienced: powerlessness. The knowledge that his body was beyond his control, that his will couldn't change what was happening. Maybe that was as close to empathy as he could get. Michelle Chen, Rachel's sister, lived a different kind of aftermath. She had moved to Seattle 6 years after Rachel's death, seeking distance from the place where her sister had been killed, from the neighborhood where investigators had searched, from the community that had been collectively traumatized. In Seattle, she worked as a project manager for a nonprofit organization focused on supporting families of homicide victims. She attended conferences. She developed support groups. She trained other counselors in trauma-informed approaches to grief that acknowledged the specific pain of losing someone to violence. There's grief, she explained in one training seminar, and then there's the particular grief of knowing that the person you love didn't die of illness or accident. They were killed by someone they trusted. That's a different experience. It's grief plus violation plus a specific kind of rage that takes years to process. Some people never process it fully. Some people are still angry at the killer 20 years later. Some people reach a place of indifference. There's no right response. But the response should never be minimized or rushed. Michelle had married again, a man named Robert Torres, an architect she had met through a friend. They had a daughter together, Emma, who was 9 years old when Rachel's remains were recovered. Michelle had not hidden the truth from Emma. She had explained in age-appropriate terms what had happened to her aunt. She had explained why her mother worked with bereaved families. She had tried, as best she could, to transform her sister's death into something meaningful. Not meaningful in a way that made the death acceptable, but meaningful in that it had prompted her to work toward preventing similar deaths, toward helping other families who had experienced similar losses. One of Michelle's colleagues at the nonprofit asked her, in a private conversation, whether she had forgiven David Chen. Michelle's response was immediate and unambiguous. "No," she said, "I will not forgive him. I don't believe in forgiveness that erases what someone did. I don't believe in forgiveness that allows the perpetrator to feel released from responsibility. What I do is, I choose not to be destroyed by hatred. I choose to channel my anger into work. I choose to make Rachel's death mean something by helping other people. But that's not forgiveness. That's survival. And it's not something David Chen deserves credit for. It's something I do for myself and for Rachel's memory, not for him." Rachel's father, Gerald Chen, lived to see his daughter's remains recovered. He was 87 years old when the search of the Cascade River located Rachel's skeletal remains. He was 91 when he died, 3 years later. In those final years, he gave several interviews to researchers and documentarians studying long-term homicide impact on families. In one interview, conducted for a documentary about the Chen case, he spoke about the Thursday calls that had defined his relationship with Rachel. "I knew her routines," he said, his voice thin but clear. "I knew that on Thursday at 6, she would call. For 30 minutes, we would talk about her week. She would ask about my life. She would tell me about work, about her marriage, though she told me less as the years went on, and I understood that things were not good. But she kept calling. That commitment, that reliability, it was how I knew her. It was how I stayed connected to her. And when she disappeared, the Thursday silence was the worst part. Not the investigation, not the uncertainty about whether she was alive. The worst part was the Thursday silence, the knowledge that that call would never come again." Gerald died in his sleep on a Thursday in 2026, 31 years after Rachel had disappeared on a Friday night. Michelle, when she received the call about her father's death, remembered that he had asked, the year before, if she thought he would see Rachel again. She had not known how to answer, but she had held his hand and told him that she hoped so, and that if he did, he could tell her about all the Thursday calls he had been saving up for 3 decades. Detective Sarah Martinez, retired and in her 70s, was contacted by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in 2023 to consult on their training programs regarding the recognition of deceptive behavior in criminal investigations. They wanted to use the David Chen case as a teaching tool specifically. The way that David's performance of grief had initially seemed credible, but eventually revealed micro-expressions and inconsistencies that contradicted his stated emotional state. Martinez agreed to conduct a seminar for agents in training. She brought video footage of David's 911 call, his interviews with police, his televised appeals for his wife's safe return. She walked through, frame by frame, the moments where his performance had seemed to slip, the slight smile that flickered across his face when he was not expecting to be observed, the way his breathing and speech patterns suggested controlled emotion rather than genuine distress, the specificity of his timeline despite his claimed emotional state. The thing about performance, Martinez told the trainees, is that it requires monitoring. You're watching yourself perform, and that watching itself is detectable. A genuinely grieving person is not thinking about how they appear. They're not managing their presentation. They're just trying to survive the moment. But someone performing grief has to think about it. They have to monitor their expression, their tone, their word choice. And that monitoring, that self-awareness, creates micro-expressions, tiny breaks in the performance where the real emotional state shows through. That's what I saw in David Chen. I saw a man who was performing exactly what he thought a devastated husband should look like. But I saw a man who was performing, not being. The seminar was well received. Afterward, one young agent asked Martinez whether she had known immediately that David had killed his wife. Martinez paused before answering. "I knew that something was wrong," she said. "I didn't know what. I didn't know for certain that he had killed her until the evidence was in place. But I knew he was lying about something. I knew he wasn't grieving authentically. And I knew that whatever he was lying about, it was significant. So I built the case from there. I didn't assume his guilt. I followed the evidence, and the evidence pointed toward guilt. That's the difference between knowing and believing. I didn't believe David Chen was guilty until the evidence required me to believe it." 25 years after Rachel Chen's death, a sociologist at Portland State University named Dr. Aaron Walsh published a book titled The Chen Reflection: How One Crime Reveals Society's Blind Spots. The book examined not just the murder and investigation, but what the case revealed about contemporary American marriage, surveillance, financial control, and the performance of normalcy in suburban life. Walsh argued that David Chen's crime was not exceptional. The elements were familiar: marital infidelity, financial deception, the victim discovering the deception, the perpetrator responding with violence. What was exceptional was that the case had been solved, that the investigation had been thorough, and that it had resulted in conviction. Most murders, Walsh noted, go unsolved. Most perpetrators of intimate partner homicide are not caught. The Chen case was notable not because of its uniqueness, but because of its rarity, the rarity of accountability. We tend to think of murder as an exceptional act, Walsh wrote, requiring exceptional circumstances or exceptional people. But the data suggests otherwise. Most murders are committed by people who are, in every other way, ordinary. They go to work, they maintain relationships, they integrate into communities, they perform normalcy with skill and consistency. What separates them from the rest of us is not some fundamental moral difference, but a specific decision made in a specific moment, a decision to choose violence over consequence, to silence another person rather than be exposed or changed by them. Walsh interviewed Michelle Chen for the book. She told him that the most difficult realization she had come to was this: my brother-in-law was not a monster. He was a man who made a choice. That's almost worse, in a way, than if he had been fundamentally evil. If he had been a monster, it would mean that these things happen because of evil people. But the reality is that ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary harm. And that means that we can't simply identify the bad people and separate ourselves from them. We have to acknowledge that the capacity is more universal than we want to admit. In 2027, 6 years after Rachel's remains were recovered, David Chen died in Stafford Correctional Institution. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death was metastatic cancer. He died with minimal ceremony, attended by a prison chaplain, Luther Grant, and 2 correctional officers. His body was cremated per his request. He had no family members who came to claim his remains. Michelle made it clear that the Chen family would not be present for any disposition of David's ashes. Gerald had already passed. David's own parents had died years before, and they had had no contact with David after his conviction, viewing his actions as a betrayal of the family name and the family's place in the community. David's ashes were scattered by the state, in a location not disclosed to the public. He had requested that his remains be returned to some connection to Rachel, perhaps to the river where he had disposed of her body. The Department of Corrections denied this request, finding it inappropriate to memorialize a murderer at the scene where the crime was disposed. Instead, his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, likely a forest or a waterway, but a location disconnected from Rachel, disconnected from the crime, disconnected from any meaningful memorial. In this way, David achieved something he had, perhaps, not anticipated when he disposed of Rachel in the river. He became absent, not famous, despite the documentaries and the books and the training seminars. Not remembered with any fondness or respect, simply absent, a man who had existed, who had committed a crime, who had been punished, and who had then ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Michelle, when she learned of his death, did not cry. She did not express relief or closure. She simply noted the fact. David was dead. Rachel was dead. Gerald was dead. The crime was solved. The investigation was complete. And life, for the living, continued. 28 years after Rachel's death, a journalist named Lisa Hoffman conducted an oral history project focused on the investigation and the investigators. She interviewed Detective Sarah Martinez, now in her 80s, living in a quiet neighborhood south of Portland, volunteering at a victim advocacy center. In their final conversation, Hoffman asked Martinez a question that seemed to summarize the entire case. "Do you think justice was served?" Martinez took a long time before answering. She was sitting in her small home office, surrounded by case files and photographs, and the documentary evidence of a career spent in pursuit of truth. "Justice," she said slowly, "is a word we use without really understanding what it means. We say justice was served when a killer is caught and imprisoned. But is that justice? Rachel is dead. That will never change. David is dead. That changes nothing for Rachel. Her family has lived with grief and trauma and the ongoing pain of loss. How does David's imprisonment justice that? How does his death justice that? What would actual justice even look like? I don't know. I solved the crime. I found the perpetrator. I helped obtain his conviction. I helped locate the body and give the family closure. But I didn't bring Rachel back. I didn't undo the violence. I didn't heal the family. I just did my job. And my job resulted in a conviction and imprisonment. Whether that constitutes justice, I honestly don't know anymore." Martinez paused. She looked at a photograph on her desk. Rachel Chen, smiling, from an ID badge used for her marketing firm. "What I do know," Martinez continued, "is that Rachel deserved better. She deserved a life, a marriage, and she was not put off by someone she trusted. She deserved to call her father on Thursday nights for the rest of her life. She deserved to have Sunday dinners with her sister. She deserved to grow old and see what her life became. David took that from her, and nothing I did as a detective can give it back. So whether justice was served, I think the answer is no. What was served was accountability. And accountability is not the same as justice. It's just the system's way of saying what you did had consequences. But it doesn't restore what was lost. It doesn't heal what was broken. It just marks the place where justice should have existed but couldn't. Rachel Chen remains in the memory of those who knew her, a woman defined by her commitments, the Thursday calls, the Sunday dinners, the calendar she maintained, the receipts she organized, the life she structured with care and intention. She remains in the documentary evidence that solved her death: the phone records, the bank statements, the security footage, the storage unit contents, the fabric fragments, the dental records. She remains in the scholarship given annually to young women in her community. She remains in the training seminars for law enforcement. She remains in the policy changes that bear her name. She remains in the awareness of her community, in the vigilance of neighbors, in the work of counselors trained to recognize the patterns that preceded her death. But she also remains in absence, in the Thursday evening silence that no one answered, in the Sunday dinner that was never attended, in the calendar that was never updated, in the life that was never lived, in the future that was never experienced. The Chen case is, in many ways, a story about the ways that society responds to violence when violence has already occurred. How investigators pursue truth, how prosecutors build cases, how communities process trauma, how systems of justice attempt, however imperfectly, to restore some semblance of order and accountability. But it is, fundamentally, a story about a woman who did everything right and was still murdered. A woman who was careful and organized and faithful and committed, and none of it protected her. A woman who was killed by someone she trusted, in the home where she should have been safe, for reasons that had more to do with his failures than with anything she had done. 28 years after Rachel disappeared, the question that remains is not about David Chen or detective work or investigative procedure. The question that remains is the simplest and the most impossible. Why? Why did he choose violence? What was the moment where he decided that killing was preferable to being exposed? What combination of shame and rage and entitlement and fear drove him to that specific decision on that specific night? And the answer, which may be the most troubling answer of all, is that there is no satisfying explanation. There is no reason that justifies it. There is no understanding that makes it acceptable. There is only the fact that it happened, and the consequences that have rippled forward through nearly 3 decades, touching everyone who knew Rachel, everyone who investigated her death, everyone who tried, in whatever way they could, to make meaning from her absence. The river continues to flow, as it did on the night when Rachel was placed in its waters. The forest grows around the location where David claimed he had buried her. The neighborhood where she lived continues to function, inhabited by different people, though the memory of what happened there persists. And Thursday nights come and go, year after year, with no one calling Gerald to tell him about her week, no one maintaining that 30-minute conversation that had defined their relationship for 31 years. This is what remains. Not justice, perhaps, but accountability. Not healing, perhaps, but memory. Not restoration, perhaps, but the knowledge that what happened mattered, that Rachel mattered, that her absence has been witnessed and recorded and acknowledged by the community and the system that failed to protect her. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what we have learned to offer in the place where justice should have existed but could not.